This is my LC475, which was an impulse purchase on eBay a number of months ago. It was introduced by Apple in the October of 1993 and retailed for about $1,000 US. The reason it's special to me is my father purchased one for our family back in the summer of 1994. He grew tired of bringing home his SE30 from work along with his LaserWriter printer and decided it would be easier to have a computer at home. He was in the Royal Air Force here in the UK and worked on a surface-to-air missile system called Rapier, and later Rapier 2000. His title was an instructor of gunnery and therefore produced the training syllabuses for the soldiers who operated the system. Because a lot of it was classroom based and there were no manuals from the manufacturers, he designed and created the training material. Because of this, he needed a computer that he could do desktop publishing on, which of course meant he had to have a Mac. In his office he had a large external grayscale display, so he must have had a video upgrade card installed inside the SE30. I have vague recollections of him using Cricket Draw and HyperCard to create manuals with, but it has been a good number of years ago, so I can't be certain. I used to enjoy drawing in Mac Paint and printing things out on the LaserWriter, and playing games such as Lode Runner, Stunt Copter and Reversi. So as you can see, this is why I have a fondness for Macs, as they were really the first computers I ever used. When released, Apple had several different models to reflect an emerging industry trend of naming product families for their target customers. It was sold as the Quadra 605 to businesses, and the LC475 to the educational market, and the Performer 475 for home users. The Quadra 605 could only be purchased through an Apple authorized reseller, whereas the Performer 475 could be purchased from a local computer store. This machine came with 12MB of RAM and the original 160MB hard drive, which will be upgrading to a much larger drive later. I'll also be upgrading the RAM and installing a network card to see if we'll be able to get this thing online. We only had 8MB of RAM in our LC475, and I remember my dad having to pay about £80 for a 4MB SIM. I purchased a 32MB SIM on eBay recently for £9.99 with free shipping, which gives us a total of 36MB as 4MB is soldered to the system board. I don't think I'd ever believed that I'd have the maximum official amount of RAM installed. However, it has been found out since that this line of machines will support a single 128MB SIM, bringing the total amount of RAM to an unbelievable, for the time, 132MB. In the early to mid-90s, the floppy disks were king when it came to removable storage, and of course the LC475 has one built in. Inside the case it's the only form of removable media, as this model was sold as the LC, which stands for low cost, and therefore bundling an internal CD-ROM would have cost more and meant a larger case design. The machine can be opened by removing a single screw at the back of the case and unclipping two clips. The top of the case can then be easily removed. Upon opening it up, the hard drive can be seen in the bottom left of the case. The drive is connected to the motherboard by an incredibly short 50-pin SCSI cable. It's a shame that Apple didn't choose to use an IDE bus, which may have made for a cheaper machine. In the middle is a single fan, a single speaker, and the floppy drive is at the front. All can be removed without a screwdriver. At the rear of the case is a small power supply, but it doesn't include a power out for a monitor. Next are two VRAM SIMs, which we'll talk about in a minute. A single 72-pin SIM is right next to the Motorola 68LC040 CPU. And at the rear is a single PDS or processor direct slot, which can be used to install additional cache, processor upgrades, video and network cards. Along the back are two 3.5mm jacks for audio in and out, a single ADB port, a 25-pin external SCSI port, two 8-pin serial ports and an Apple DB15 monitor connector. It has a surprising amount of ports for such a low-end device. The CPU is passively cooled and requires no cooler. It can be upgraded to a full 68040 processor, which includes a maths coprocessor, also known as an FPU, which tremendously improves floating point calculations. The PRAM battery must be working to provide video to the display. A dead PRAM battery, also known as a parameter RAM battery, will cause the machine not to post a display on boot. Power is provided to the system board via a 7-pin connector, although only 5 other pins are populated. Power to the floppy is provided by a combined power and data cable. The fan connector is in the middle of the board, and on the far left is a Molex connector for the hard drive. As I mentioned before, it is possible to remove the CPU and replace it with a full 68040 CPU. Faster CPUs can be installed but will only run at 25MHz. However, you can overclock to 33MHz, but this requires the resoldering of two resistors. However, doing so can cause some compatibility issues with system software installers. The video memory from the factory was supplied by two 256KB VRAM SIMs, which are not to be confused with normal RAM SIMs. These can be replaced with two 512KB ones, which allow for the display of 16-bit colour, which is approximately 32,000 colours. The PDS slot provided a limited measure of hardware expandability without going to the expense of providing fully fledged bus expansion slots. Typically, a machine would feature multiple bus expansion slots, if any. However, there were never more than one PDS slot. The hard drive is an Apple-branded IBM drive, which includes special Apple firmware that Apple Disk Tools will work with. Third-party drives will not work unless the software is patched, but third-party software solutions could be used as a workaround. The RAM can be swapped out easily and takes industry-standard 72-pin SIMs. This is a welcome change to the rest of the Apple proprietary connectors, hard drive firmware, monitor connectors and upgrade slots. Also, when later lines of PowerPC desktops were released, they used the industry-standard PCI slots. Some came with the IDE bus and used 168-pin DIMMs for memory. This allowed for more easy and less expensive upgrades, as manufacturers could release hardware that worked on either platform or simply required a different firmware. Working 50-pin SCSI drives are becoming more rare than rocking horse poop, and the ones that are advertised for sale go for stupid money, as over time these drives are failing due to their age. Luckily, I found a third-party 2GB drive that I'm going to install and replace the 160MB drive. I need to be careful with the plastics holding the hard drive bracket in place, as this plastic has become brittle with age. The drive is held in a sled, which is held in place by 4 plastic clips. Around the back is a short SCSI cable and a Molex connector. Removing these and the drive is free. Finding a replacement drive is getting harder and harder. I've borrowed a 2GB Quantum Fireball hard drive from another Mac I have, which I will be installing in the LC475 and replacing the 160MB drive. This drive looks like an ordinary drive and has a 50-pin connector which will plug into a short SCSI cable. Mounting the new drive requires unscrewing of 4 Phillips screws which hold the existing drive into a metal bracket. Once freed, the drive can be removed and set aside. Then it's a case of reversing these steps but using the replacement drive. I found it easier to connect the cables first and then gently place the drive in the case, ensuring I don't bend the plastic clips too much as I don't want them to snap. I am toying with the idea of replacing the drive with a SCSI to SD drive, as a lot of people have had success installing these into older machines. But at the moment the price is well over £100 and it's a lot of money considering I won't be using the machine that often. For those of you who aren't familiar with a SCSI to SD, it's basically an emulator for old SCSI hard drives. It allows replacing one or several SCSI drives with a SD memory card, which can then be read and written on a more modern machine. Disk access speeds are also much faster. So now that the RAM has been upgraded, the hard disk has been replaced with a much larger drive, it's time to populate the PDS slot. Here is a Farallon Ethermac LC NSC card, providing 10 megabit network connectivity. Drivers are not necessarily required to get it working, however the driver disk contains extensions and control panels that may not already be installed, plus some quick additional diagnostic software. Installation is easy and quick. The LC475 has a small plastic cover that is held in place with a metal clip. Removal of this and the plastic cover allows the RJ45 connector on the LC to be accessed via the rear of the case. Some Ethernet cards have a AAUI port, but this card has a standard RJ45 port. So now that the upgrades have been installed, it's time to boot the machine from a Disk Tools floppy and try to format the drive. Booting from a floppy drive takes over a minute. Once a very basic macOS is loaded, opening Drive Setup presents us with a problem. By default, as mentioned earlier, doesn't support the third-party drives, but this drive only has one partition on it and can be erased from the special menu in the Finder. This drive was used in another machine and unfortunately has a version of macOS which isn't compatible with a 68K CPU in this machine. When trying to partition a drive in Drive Setup on a non-Apple branded drive, Drive Setup will simply say not supported. It doesn't mean that you can't use another manufacturer's drive inside your machine. You just might not be able to partition it in the fashion that you might like. For most people, I don't think this would have been a big issue, as it's not the end of the world. And it was quickly found out that this was an artificial software restriction, which could be easily reversed. FWB tools and others don't seem to care what manufacturer's drive you have inside your computer, and will allow you to partition the drives as you see fit. It also allows greater control over the partitions too, so if you really did want to fiddle, there were options. I'm glad to see Apple drop this by the time I had my iMac TV a good few years later. It came with a stock 10GB IDE drive, but I upgraded this to a larger drive myself later. I had a bit of buyer's remorse after I purchased the LC. I was looking at external CD-ROM drives once I'd won the auction, but everything seemed really expensive. So then I had a crazy idea. I knew Apple had released System 7.5.3 on floppy, but I've never been keen on that version, so I started to see if the same had been done for macOS 8. Happily, it didn't take me long to find out, as someone had uploaded the floppy disk images to macintoshgarden.org, so I downloaded them and wrote them to some floppy disks. These aren't the original install disks, but ones I made. The labels were created using an Avery floppy disk Word template and a photo of the Disk Tools floppy I found online. I therefore set about creating these reproduction floppies for my project. I'm quite happy with how they turned out. Writing them was pretty easy, and I only had one failure on disk 6, but after formatting it and trying it again, it seemed to work. I was going to do a time-lapse of the install on the LC, but I couldn't find my VGA splitter, so I plugged the LC directly into the back of my capture card and recorded it that way. So here for your viewing pleasure is 45 minutes of macOS 8 being installed by floppy. Condensed into 3.5 minutes, of course. I hope you all enjoyed that as much as I did. It's about as much fun as watching paint dry, I can tell you. In all honesty, it wasn't as painful as I thought it would be. The first disk took about 6 minutes, but then after that the process was nice and quick. After the install was complete, I ran through the setup wizard, configured my location, date and time, sharing options, etc., and I installed the extra software for the network card. During the reboot, I connected the Ethernet cable. I had to ensure that TCP/IP was set to use the new Ethernet card in the TCP/IP control panel. But I did this and no DHCP address showed up, so I wasn't sure it was working initially. So I decided to open up the manufacturer's software tools to have a quicker look around. Everything looked fine, so I decided to see if I could get the LC475 online. However, this is where I ran into my first stumbling block. Due to the capacity of the floppy disks, the install is just the macOS 8 install with absolutely no third-party software. On an installer CD, you generally have optional installers which allow you to install things like Stuffit Expander, sometimes Adobe Acrobat Reader, web browsers, specifically Netscape Navigator or Microsoft Internet Explorer, but when doing a floppy disk install, it literally just installs the operating system with a few apps like Simple Text, and that's it. I do have a Windows 2000 virtual machine running on a PC here at home, which I've installed services for Macintosh. That allows Macs to talk to Windows servers and share files, but I hadn't booted it up. So, whilst browsing eBay one day, I came across this. This is an Apple external 150 SCSI CD-ROM drive, and yes, I could have used it to install macOS 8 with, as I do have a system CD lying around here somewhere. I thought the floppy disk thing would be much more fun, as after all you've no doubt seen a software install from CD. Also, as this is a very slow CD-ROM drive which only runs at 1x, it actually takes longer to boot from the install CD and do an install than it does from floppy. I suspect this is probably because the OS on the CD is much larger due to the space the CD-ROM provides, whereas the floppy has to be extremely condensed. SCSI drives were always a little bit awkward compared to what we're used to today. It's not hot swappable, meaning that you have to shut the computer down first, connect cables, turn it on, and then turn the computer on. You can't just boot the machine and turn the drive on later, as the SCSI drive won't work that way. The drive requires CDs to be placed in a caddy, which is then loaded into the CD-ROM. This protects the disks, but Apple soon changed the design with the introduction of the 300E, which used the more common ejecting tray mechanism. The machine will boot from CD-ROM, and to my surprise will read burn CDs, so I now have 3 ways to get software onto the machine: floppy, CD-ROM and Ethernet. So let's install a web browser. Luckily, I found my macOS 8 CD-ROM, which has Internet Explorer 3 for Mac on. Installing takes a minute or two, then requires a system reboot. It seems funny now how we take installing software and not requiring a reboot for granted these days. I've never been a fan of Netscape. I found that even back in the day there was too much bloat with it. And when we had our LC, we didn't even have a modem for it, so didn't need a browser. When we did get on the internet in about 1996, we used Internet Explorer 2 that came with Microsoft Windows 95. I still remember visiting the Yahoo homepage and watching it slowly download and render on our PC. As I've talked before in other videos about getting these old machines online, it's becoming more and more of a challenge. Websites now support much higher encryption methods for encrypting the communication between your computer and the site. So because of this, doesn't allow the computer that doesn't support these encryption methods to show the site properly, or if at all. However, there are a few exceptions. Websites such as the oldnet.com allow you to more easily access archived websites from archive.org. The oldnet.com is a project that will take you back to the early days of the World Wide Web. Pulling in results from the Wayback Machine, this website strips away the modern scripting language that archive.org usually inserts, meaning that you can browse the 90s internet again on your retro machine. A particular favourite retro site of mine at the moment is retro.mac84.net. This is a simple page designed and created by Stephen from Mac84, who, if you haven't already checked out his channel, I suggest you do. A link is in the description. His content is just the kind of thing I enjoy, even the 4+ hour live streams he does, even though I have to admit I do skip forward in them until I find the good stuff. While there isn't much content on there, it at least allows you to confirm that your machine is indeed online. It doesn't seem to matter which machine, device or browser I try to get onto google.com with. It always seems to work, albeit with varying degrees of success. Our next site will be google.com. Once loaded, the familiar Google logo doesn't load, but it does after you search for a term. It displays the results in what I can only describe as best attempt efforts. It is no way near the experience we are used to these days, and generally none of the links can be clicked on due to the aforementioned SSL problem. But these machines weren't designed to be racing along the information superhighway, as when they were released it was still a fledgling thing in itself. As no other storage medium was as ubiquitous as the floppy, most software came on it. Even magazines included free cover discs and managed to squeeze on an incredible amount of data onto them. But slowly and surely the cost of CD-ROMs and the media was falling. So I suppose you're wondering where I got this CD-ROM from, as I'd already said they seemed to be expensive after I won the LC. Well, after scouring eBay for a week or two, I found this one, which had a typo in its name and ended at 1 AM on a Monday morning. Most people would be tucked up in bed fast asleep, but not me. I set an alarm, and in the last few seconds as the auction ticked down, I put a bid in and waited. I was filled with dread, thinking that someone might outbid my maximum, but then the auction finished and I'd won. Score! I guess the seller was hoping for quite a bit more than what I'd paid, but shipped it speedily, and I had some more glorious beigeness to add to my collection. The CD-ROM came with 2 caddies, a thick 25-pin to Centronics SCSI cable, and the original power adapter, so everything I needed to add multimedia capabilities to this machine. Generally, I'm quite ruthless when it comes to getting rid of unwanted items around the house, but some things I can't bear to part with. I've been carrying around this CD of PF Magic's Dogs for the latter part of 25 years, which I purchased using my pocket money when I was about 14. It's sat languishing in my CD wallet for the last 15 years or so, as it won't work on anything higher than macOS 8.1. Thankfully, emulating old machines is now a thing, so I've managed to get it up and running in Basilisk 2 and Sheepshaver. It's a pointless piece of software. You adopt a puppy and you're supposed to look after it, feed it and train it. It's supposed to learn and develop, but as I'm famously patient, I've never got to that stage. This software also requires another system reboot, but that's because it installs a Dogs extension, which is needed when the machine boots. I don't recall the exact reason for this, but I think it's got something to do with it being able to be used as a screensaver. Still, it's fun to hear and see it on this machine. Did I try Will It Doom? And, well, yes and no. I couldn't find the original Doom out there, but I assume it does exist. Doom 2 will run on a 68K machine, but I wasn't able to get more than 4 or 5 frames per second on it, and as I'm terrible and it requires accuracy, it really wasn't playable. What else did I use the LC for? Well, doing some homework and playing with other educational titles, but mostly playing SimCity 2000 that I begged my dad for Christmas one year. This wasn't your newfangled CD-ROM version, which I'd been hoping for, however. It was the 2 floppy disk set. I used to spend hours and hours playing on the LC and basically hogging it, then pouting when I was told that it was somebody else's turn. What's odd about these machines is they really were standalone devices, yet today if our internet drops out the computer seems entirely pointless. How times have changed. Well, as usual, I've rambled on for much longer than anyone should do, so I'm going to end the video here. Thank you so much for watching. I hope to see you in the next one.